I still remember the first time I heard Adnan Syed's name, and it wasn't from a documentary or a podcast. It was a winter night, one of those nights where the cold finds its way through every window crack and settles behind your ribs. I was driving home with the radio playing low, the kind of static-filled chatter you hear in the background while your mind wanders. And then I heard it, a voice announcing a breaking update in the case that had once consumed half the world. It felt strange, almost intrusive, like someone slowly prying open a door that should have stayed shut. Even now, I can feel how the air inside that car seemed to thicken, as if the past itself had weight. It's unsettling, isn't it? How a name can pull you back into a feeling, a moment, a question you once buried because it had no answer. Adnan Syed. It's a name tied to so many contradictions, innocence tangled with doubt, faith intertwined with fear, memory battling time. And maybe that's why the case never really left any of us. It hovered, lingering like a half-formed shadow in the corner of a room. You'd swear you forgot it until something nudged it awake. Back then, everyone had an opinion. Everyone was sure they knew what happened in 1999, what happened to Hai Min Lee, what happened in that park, that car, that school hallway. But over the years, the certainty started to crumble. The lines blurred. Witnesses changed. Evidence cracked under scrutiny. And suddenly, what once felt like a closed door began to creak open again. It wasn't justice, and it wasn't mercy either. It was something stranger, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Because when a story refuses to die, it's usually because something inside it is still alive. When word spread that the case had taken a new turn in 2024, I felt that same heaviness again, as if the past had crawled out from underneath its own grave just to remind us it never truly rested. People love updates to famous cases, but this one felt different. It wasn't just an update. It felt like a pulse, like the story had been lying dormant, waiting for the right moment to remind the world that it still had teeth. I remember sitting down that night, scrolling through the article like I was afraid of what I might find, and as I read, something strange happened. I felt a creeping sense of déjà vu, like the past was folding over the present, wrapping it in the same unanswered questions I thought we'd already asked. A resentencing, new legal motions, whispers of prosecutorial misconduct, conflicting forensic timelines, evidence that never made it into the original trial, evidence that never should have stayed buried. It's unsettling how the truth behaves in these cases. Sometimes it hides in plain sight. Sometimes it's buried under paperwork. And sometimes it's alive in the memories of people who no longer want to remember it all. But it's always there, breathing under the surface. As I kept reading, the room felt colder, like the shadows stretched a little longer than they should have, not because the story was unfamiliar, but because it felt too familiar, almost cyclical, as if time itself was replaying a scene we still hadn't learned the lesson from. And I found myself thinking about the moment everything changed back in 1999. A girl missing, a diary, a breakup, a community that didn't know it was about to become a crime scene frozen in national memory. I wasn't there, of course, but the details feel etched into the collective consciousness. The phone records, the trunk pop story, the Leakin Park burial timeline. It's strange how you can remember things you never lived, like the case made its way into your bloodstream and never left. But here's the part that always gets me. Time doesn't just move forward, it circles back. It drags past decisions into present consequences. And when 2024 arrived with its new legal twist, it was like watching a ghost walk into a courtroom. A ghost shaped by decades of doubt, stories, grief, and obsession. I found myself imagining what it must feel like to be him, to wake up every day, knowing millions of strangers have theories about your life, to know that every word you ever said has been dissected, rearranged, turned over, judged, that every silence has been interpreted, every moment of your adolescence replayed like a trap. Whether guilty or innocent, that kind of attention changes a person. It fractures them. It wraps around their neck like a cold hand. And in some strange, awful way, that's the part that unsettles me the most. Not the crime itself, not the decades of debate, but the feeling that this story, this tragedy, made all of us into voyeurs, observers staring at a wound that refused to heal. And now we're back again, leaning over the same wound, asking if the bleeding ever really stopped. In the past year, the legal fight took a turn that nobody expected, not even those who lived and breathed this case every day. There were motions challenging the validity of the vacated conviction, questions about the state's transparency, arguments about whether justice had been undone or finally set free. And somewhere inside that maze of legal language, there was a strange sense of dread. Because when a story is this big, this tangled, it doesn't just move forward, it pulls everything down with it. I don't know why this case feels different from others. Maybe because it's been told so many times that the telling itself became part of the evidence. Maybe because every time the truth tries to surface, something drags it back under. Or maybe because, deep down, the details don't just disturb us. They remind us of something uncomfortable, how fragile memory really is, how easily the human mind can be swayed, convinced, reshaped by pressure, fear, loneliness, or the need to find an answer where none is clear. And the scariest part, there are moments in this case where you can feel the system itself creaking like an old house at night, wood shifting, pipes knocking, floorboards groaning under the weight of something unseen. Moments where you wonder if the people in charge of evidence, timelines, witness testimonies were as steady as they seemed. Because when the legal system becomes a character itself, the story stops being about justice and starts becoming something darker, something that feels alive. As I sat there that night, scrolling through the newest documents, I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. I kept thinking about how strange it is to revisit a crime decades later, as if expecting the past to reveal a new angle. But the past doesn't change. Only our interpretation does. And sometimes, when enough time passes, when enough people question what was once accepted, the truth starts to shape-shift. You know that feeling you get when you walk into a room you haven't been in for a long time? Everything looks the same, but something feels off. A picture slightly crooked, a smell you don't remember, a drawer left open. It's familiar, but not safe. That's what revisiting the Adnan Syed case feels like. A room you thought you understood, only to realize you never really did. And as I kept reading, I had this strange sensation that someone, somewhere, knew something the rest of us didn't, that there were pieces still sitting in the dark, untouched. And maybe that's why this case refuses to disappear. Maybe it doesn't want to. Maybe it can't. Because something about the truth here, whatever it is, feels unfinished. And the deeper you go, the more you feel something else rising beneath the surface. Something that doesn't want to stay buried. I didn't expect the documents to hit me the way they did. Maybe it was the timing. Maybe it was the way the news broke, quietly, almost cautiously, like people were afraid that saying it too loudly would make it vanish. But there was something strange in the air the day the new evidence surfaced. Something that didn't feel like hope or justice or even outrage. It felt more like a warning, a soft one, the kind that slips under doors and settles into your home before you realize it's there. I spent hours just staring at my screen, reading every line of the motion, the way someone reads a letter from a person they once loved and didn't understand. I wasn't looking for a twist. I wasn't expecting a revelation. But the case has always had this eerie way of pulling you closer the more you try to keep your distance. It's like a story that gets its fingers around your collar and refuses to let go until you look it in the eye. What struck me first weren't the conclusions, but the cracks, the small, sharp splinters hidden between the paragraphs, a timeline that didn't match, a witness who wasn't where they claimed to be, a piece of information that had been known but never shared. It was like watching a house that looked perfectly solid start to shift in slow motion, just enough to make the walls groan, just enough to remind you that nothing stays buried forever. Even the dates had weight. Each one felt like a knock on a door. January, March, August. Court filings that carried that cold, bureaucratic tone, but underneath them, something raw was moving. I could feel it. I could feel how the past was pushing its way back through the seams of a story that never fit together neatly in the first place. And then there was the thing that never fails to send a chill down my spine. Evidence that should have been disclosed the first time. Evidence that wasn't. That's the kind of detail that makes you stop breathing for a moment. Because it's not just a mistake. It's a shadow cast by someone whose identity you don't know, someone who stood in a place of authority and chose silence instead of truth. Silence is powerful enough in a courtroom, but in a murder case, silence becomes a ghost. I caught myself leaning closer to my screen, like I could somehow slip into the file and see the moment everything went wrong. But all I saw were lines of text, and yet they felt alive. They felt like dominoes that had been set up decades ago, now finally tipping over one by one. I remember specifically the paragraph about the alternative suspects, information that had been known, but never turned over. That was the moment I felt something cold slip down my spine. Not fear, exactly, but recognition. Because that kind of omission doesn't just happen. It leaves behind a trail of questions, each sharper than the last. Who knew? Who didn't? And what did that silence cost someone? Every time the case resurfaced in the past, it came with heat, public fury, internet debates, the noise of millions trying to play detective from behind their screens. But this time felt different. This time it wasn't loud. It was quiet, almost too quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like the moments right before a storm hits. You can sense the pressure shifting even if you don't see the clouds yet. I kept reading, and with every page, a strange tightness gathered in my chest. Not because I knew what it meant, but because I didn't. Because the details were like dark water, still on the surface, but impossibly deep. And I found myself thinking about the people who carried this story silently for years. The families, the lawyers, the neighbors who stopped talking about the case but never stopped thinking about it. The person who wrote that diary years before she disappeared. The boy who walked to the library and never imagined that 25 years later we'd still be examining every step he took that afternoon. Some cases fade with time. The evidence dries up, the memories blur, and eventually the truth, whatever it was, sinks into the mud. But in this case, the evidence didn't fade. It whispered. It tugged. It moved beneath the surface like something alive. And the more the legal motions dug into the past, the clearer it became that the story we were told wasn't the full one. Not even close. I found myself reading about cell tower evidence again, the kind that once seemed definitive, then questionable, then unreliable, then maybe useful, then thrown into doubt all over again. It's strange how technology ages. What once felt futuristic becomes outdated. And suddenly, the thing that convicted someone starts to look like a trick of the light, like an illusion we all believed because we wanted the case to make sense. But this case doesn't make sense. It never has. Not in a clean, linear way. It twists, it loops, it contradicts itself. And maybe that's what makes it so unnerving, because in the gaps between what we know and what we don't, something dangerous grows: doubt, fear, obsession, and sometimes the unsettling possibility that the truth was never clear to begin with. As I read deeper into the new motions, I felt this strange combination of dread and fascination. It was like walking into a room you thought you knew, only to find the furniture moved, the windows open, the lights flickering. You recognize the space, but it feels wrong, tilted somehow. One detail in the new filings stuck with me long after I closed my laptop. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't explosive. It was simply a mention of evidence that had been tested differently in recent years, or reframed or reconsidered in a way that suggested the early version of events, the version we all heard, might have rested on sand. That's the kind of realization that sits heavy in your gut, because it forces you to ask a question nobody wants to ask. If the foundation was shaky back then, how many stories built on top of it were already doomed to crack? I remember pacing my apartment that night, turning the information over in my mind like a stone I couldn't put down. The more I sat with it, the more the feeling grew. An unease that had nothing to do with guilt or innocence, and everything to do with human error, human bias, human silence. And that silence, God, that silence, feels like the most dangerous part of all. Because when evidence whispers, It's easy to ignore, easy to assume it's nothing. But when it starts talking, when it starts forcing its way into courtrooms and motions and headlines decades later, that's when you realize something was wrong from the start, something we weren't meant to see, or maybe something people hoped we wouldn't. I found myself thinking about the detectives back in 1999, flipping through notebooks, interviewing teenagers, chasing leads that made sense at the moment. And then I thought about the prosecutors who built the narrative, the defense who couldn't access what they needed, the jurors who had no idea the story was incomplete. Every person made decisions that seemed small at the time, but now, in hindsight, those decisions look like the hinges on a door that should have opened but didn't. And in the middle of it all, the evidence kept whispering through timelines that didn't match, through phone records that were misunderstood, through people who remembered too much or too little, through someone whose story changed, through someone whose story never did, through documents that no one saw until 20 years later, through the new findings in 2024 that made the entire case breathe again, like inhaling after being submerged underwater for too long. The truth is, evidence doesn't vanish. It waits, sometimes patiently, sometimes resentfully. And when it finally emerges, it doesn't just bring answers, it brings consequences. And as I read the last page of the motion that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting again, something subtle, something hidden just beneath the wording, the kind of thing you sense more than you understand. It felt like the past wasn't done with us. It felt like the evidence still had more to say. The thing that haunts me most about the Adnan Syed case isn't the evidence. It isn't the timelines or the cell records or the endless legal filings that seem to multiply like shadows at dusk. It's the memories, human memory to be exact. How fragile it is, how easily it bends under pressure, how it can build an entire truth one year and destroy it the next. The deeper I went into the new court documents, the more I felt like I wasn't reading a legal motion at all, but a psychological autopsy of the past and the memories inside it, the witness accounts, the journal entries, the recollections pulled from people who hadn't thought about these moments in 2 decades, started to feel like characters themselves, characters who didn't always agree with one another, characters who were aging, shifting, contradicting themselves without realizing it. And that's where the fear begins. Not jump scare fear, not horror movie fear, something quieter, colder. The fear of realizing that something as simple as memory can be shaped into a weapon. I kept thinking about that one witness whose story became a pillar of the original case. The one who described a timeline so specific, so certain, that entire years of someone's life turned on it. Yet, when I revisited the statements, something felt off. Not suspicious, not malicious. Just human. Too human. The inconsistencies weren't dramatic. They were subtle. The kind of changes that happen when people try to remember something under stress, or after hearing their own story repeated so many times that the repetition becomes reality. It's unsettling, because we want to believe that memory is a photograph, crisp and permanent. But it's not. It's more like a reflection in water, clear one moment, distorted the next, always shifting with the slightest ripple. I remember sitting back in my chair, letting that realization sink in, and suddenly the whole case took on a different tone for me. It stopped feeling like a puzzle with missing pieces and started feeling like a puzzle where the pieces themselves were quietly changing shape when no one was looking. The new filings in 2024 mentioned interviews, revised statements, recollections challenged by documents that contradicted them, names that resurfaced after years of silence, people who remembered details differently after being confronted with evidence from the original investigation. It felt like watching an old film reel that had been edited without telling the audience. I could almost picture the moments. A prosecutor leaning forward, asking a question a little too firmly. A detective narrowing their eyes at a teenager whose voice cracked under the weight of expectation. A witness trying to help, trying to recall something important, not knowing that their uncertainty could one day tilt the scales of justice. And I found myself wondering, how many memories do we trust that we shouldn't? I've had moments in my own life where I was sure something happened a certain way, only to have someone else insist it happened differently. And maybe, just maybe, we were both wrong. That's the terrifying part. Most of the time, memory isn't lying, it's improvising. As the case resurfaced in 2024, with new legal challenges and questions about prosecutorial conduct, the idea of memory became even more sinister. Because time corrodes details, anxiety rearranges them, repetition cements them, and fear shapes memory more powerfully than anything else. There's a section in one of the documents where the defense breaks down the reliability of a timeline given decades earlier. And, as I read it, I felt a heaviness forming in my chest, not because I was shocked, but because I wasn't. I understood how easily it could happen, how the mind fills in gaps, smooths over uncertainties, builds stories that feel true even when they're not. And then there were the people who didn't remember anything at all, not out of guilt, but because life kept moving, pulling them away from a moment that the legal system never let go of. They were asked to step backward into a version of themselves that no longer existed, as if memory is a door you can open at will. But the truth is, sometimes when you open that door, there's nothing on the other side but dust. One thing I read that stuck with me was the mention of suppressed information, alternative suspects, behavioral notes, statements that were never disclosed, not because a memory failed Ma, but because a human decision interfered. And if memory is fragile, then decisions made in secrecy are dangerous. It reminded me of something someone once told me. A hidden truth becomes a ghost, and ghosts don't stay quiet. That line kept echoing in my head as I read about the ways memories in this case had been shaped, pressured, doubted, or outright ignored. Every forgotten detail felt like a whisper. Every contradiction felt like a warning. I wondered what it must feel like for the families, the ones who had to live with questions instead of answers, to rely on memories they once trusted, only to see them unravel in a courtroom decades later. It must feel like waking up in a house you've lived in your whole life, only to find the furniture rearranged, the lights flickering, the doors you once passed through locked without explanation. There's something deeply unsettling about seeing a person's life depend on the fallibility of human recollection. How many people swear they saw something but didn't? How many people misremember small details that become massive in a courtroom? How many stories collapse when a single memory is re-examined under a harsh fluorescent light? The documents talked about memory with clinical detachment, timeline inconsistencies, witness reliability, statements that didn't align with physical evidence. But reading between the lines, I could feel something deeper, something darker, like the case itself was reminding us that truth isn't always what people remember. It's what they're willing to stand by when the world questions them. And that's the haunting part, because in this case, memories didn't just change. They evolved. They aged. They were influenced by pressure, by the community, by the investigators, by time. Some memories grew sharper. Others fell apart completely. And when 2024 brought the case back into the spotlight, those same memories were put on display once again, like artifacts in a museum, fragile, cracked, and far too exposed. I couldn't shake the feeling that memory is the real villain in this story, not because it lies, but because it tries its best to tell the truth, even when it can't. And when memories turn against you, when they crumble, contradict, or shift beneath your feet, the ground you stand on suddenly feels unstable, like you could sink at any moment into a version of the past that isn't yours. There was one part of the filings that mentioned a key witness who later recanted, not in a dramatic, headline-worthy way, but quietly, almost apologetically, as if they had finally admitted to themselves what they couldn't admit in front of police years earlier. Reading that section made my chest tighten in a way I can't explain, because I could feel the human side of it, the guilt, the confusion, the realization that something you said 20 years ago carried consequences you weren't prepared to face. And that brings me to the thought that unsettled me more than anything else. How many lives have been changed because someone remembered something incorrectly, or confidently, or fearfully? The new filings didn't give answers. They didn't tell us what really happened. They didn't solve the puzzle. Instead, they revealed something much more frightening, that the puzzle pieces themselves might have been warped from the beginning. And once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. I couldn't unfeel the quiet horror of a case built on memories that weren't sturdy enough to carry the weight of a life sentence. Because in the end, the scariest thing about the truth isn't that it can be hidden. It's that it can be forgotten. I've always believed that courtrooms have their own kind of silence, not the peaceful kind you find in a library or an empty park, but a heavy silence that sticks to your skin, the kind that seems to breathe back at you. And when the Adnan Syed case returned in 2024 and 2025 for hearings, motions, reversals, counter-motions, and the unsettling tug-of-war between the courts, that silence became its own character. I wasn't sitting in that courtroom physically, but as I read every transcript, every judge's comment, every defense rebuttal, I felt like I was sitting right in the back row, spine pressed against a cold wooden bench, watching shadows move along the walls. Courtrooms expose people. They strip away the room for small talk and excuses. You sit there as yourself, whether you like it or not. And this courtroom, in this case, felt especially cruel. The moment I read the judge's remarks about whether the vacated conviction was properly handled, about whether the prosecution had acted transparently, I felt a familiar chill, not the kind you get from a twist in a movie. Something deeper, something rooted in that uncomfortable place where justice and human error collide. The judge questioned the process. Then the appellate court questioned the judge. Then the motions questioned everyone who came before. It felt like a haunted house made of paperwork. Every step led deeper into a maze of legal contradictions. Every door you opened led to another room filled with more questions. And the walls felt like they were whispering, not with ghosts, but with decades of unresolved tension. I imagined what it must have been like for the people physically present in that courtroom. The fluorescent lights casting that sickly white glow on everyone's faces. The sharp tapping of keyboards documenting every breath. The rustle of papers sounding louder than footsteps in an empty hallway. The way no one dared cough. Courtrooms amplify every human sound until it feels accusatory. And then, at the center of it all, there was Adnan, a man whose entire adult life, every holiday, every memory, every dream, was shaped by a story that may never have been fully told. He sat there, a living contradiction. To some, a wrongfully convicted man. To others, a freed guilty one. To many, a symbol of the flaws of the system. But what struck me most wasn't him. It was what the courtroom revealed about the system itself. Because in 2024 and 2025, the system didn't appear as a noble structure or a villain. It appeared human, too human, flawed, tired, inconsistent, defensive, like a person waking up from a decades-long sleep and realizing they'd made mistakes they could no longer justify. One appellate judge's comments hit me harder than I expected. They said something about procedural integrity and the appearance of fairness. Those aren't phrases you use lightly. They're the legal equivalent of saying something feels wrong here, even if we can't yet prove why. That's when I felt the horror shift. It wasn't just in the case itself. It was in the realization that the courtroom, the place meant to separate truth from lies, was wrestling with its own memory issues, its own fears, its own ghosts. As I read further, I started noticing a strange pattern. So many statements began with "upon review," "upon reconsideration," "upon clarification," as if the legal system had suddenly realized it needed to look at itself in the mirror. And what it saw wasn't something it could ignore anymore. The transcripts described how evidence was questioned, how procedures were debated, how the prosecution's actions from decades earlier were now being analyzed with almost forensic precision. Lawyers were no longer arguing about guilt or innocence. They were arguing about the ghost of a process, about mistakes that lingered in the walls like the scent of something burned long ago. And strangely, the whole courtroom felt like it was creaking. That creaking kept getting louder when the appellate court reinstated the conviction for procedural issues, not because they believed the evidence was strong, but because they believed the process wasn't properly followed. It was like watching someone pull a nail out of an old wooden beam only to realize the entire structure might shift with it. I tried to imagine the atmosphere in the courtroom on the day that decision was announced. How many breaths were held? How many hearts dropped into stomachs? How many people realized that the case wasn't going to end quietly? And then came 2024 with the resentencing battles, the accusations that the state moved too fast, too quietly, too opaquely. Judges questioning whether victims' families had been properly notified. Lawyers debating whether transparency had been sacrificed in the pursuit of justice. It wasn't just a legal fight anymore. It was psychological warfare, and the courtroom became the battleground. I imagined myself sitting there, watching the lawyers circle each other like predators that didn't know who was prey. You could almost hear the tension crackling in the air, the way it does before a thunderstorm. And no matter which side you leaned toward, you couldn't ignore the feeling that something fundamental was being exposed. Courtrooms are supposed to bring clarity, but this one felt like a place where clarity went to die. There's a moment in the transcript where the judge pauses, as if weighing something invisible. And in that brief pause, I swear I felt something ripple through the story, like the past shifted slightly, like something unseen moved in the corner of the room. You'd miss it if you read too quickly. But if you sit with it, if you let that moment sink in, it feels almost supernatural. Not because ghosts were literally present, but because the consequences of the past behave like ghosts. They linger, they follow you, they demand acknowledgement. As I turned the pages, I kept picturing the courtroom in dim lighting, even though I knew it was harshly bright. That's just how it felt in my mind, like a place where the truth had to fight to be seen. A place where everyone was waiting for someone else to make the first honest move. And then there were the victims' families, sitting in the courtroom after 25 years, listening to lawyers argue about things that should have been resolved decades ago. Their grief is the quietest thing in the room, but somehow the loudest. It stretches across time. It touches everything. It makes the legal argument feel small, like a shadow next to something massive. One mother described feeling blindsided by the way the vacated conviction was handled. That detail stayed with me. Blindsided, such a simple word, but when spoken in a courtroom, it becomes a weight, a presence, a reminder that real people bleed underneath every motion, every decision, every piece of paper, and with every hearing, every appeal, every reconsideration, the courtroom felt less like a place of justice and more like a house full of locked rooms, each one holding a different version of the truth. Some doors stayed shut, some cracked open, some swung wide when nobody expected it. And that's when I realized the real horror of this courtroom wasn't the crime. It wasn't the possibility of a wrongful conviction. It wasn't even the flawed process. It was the feeling that the truth, whatever it is, has been wandering its halls for 25 years, brushing past people who never recognized it, like a ghost with no language. And as the case moved through 2024 and 2025, the courtroom didn't feel like a place where the truth was finally coming out. It felt like a place where the truth was pacing, waiting, watching, trying to find a way in. There's something deeply unsettling about evidence that refuses to disappear. Most cases settle eventually, either under the finality of a conviction or the exhaustion of time. But the Adnan Syed case is one of those rare stories where the evidence behaves like a living thing. It shifts, it resurfaces, it decays, and then regenerates. And the more I studied the latest developments, the new filings, the lab analyses, the arguments about forensic reliability, the more I felt like I was looking at something breathing under the surface. It started with a single line in one of the motions. Something technical, almost clinical. The kind of sentence you usually skim past. It mentioned a review of biological evidence, and the phrase, additional analysis performed in recent years. My eyes lingered on that line for a long moment, because it felt like a door cracking open. A door that no one expected to open again after 2 decades. I leaned back, staring at the words like they were trying to tell me something. Evidence doesn't just magically generate itself years after the fact. It has to have been there all along, waiting for someone to look at it through a different lens. And that realization hit me with a strange, sinking heaviness, because if the evidence was reanalyzed, reinterpreted, or reassessed, what else in this case might be shifting under our feet? I went deeper into the documents, scrolling slowly, the way you do when you're afraid of what you might find. The reports described how certain items collected in 1999 weren't tested with modern methods until decades later. Back then, forensic science wasn't what it is today. Biological testing was limited. DNA degradation was a problem nobody could fully solve. And sometimes, decisions were made not based on science, but on strategy. That's when the horror crept in, because if the crime scene evidence had been handled differently, interpreted differently, or tested differently, the entire narrative that shaped the case could have unfolded another way. And suddenly, I felt like I was staring at a crime scene that was still alive. One detail in particular made my breath hitch, the mention that the DNA found under the victim's fingernails didn't match Adnan. It didn't match him back then. It didn't match him now. And yet, for years, this detail sat in the shadow of all the other circumstantial pieces the state used to stitch together their version of events. That mismatch should have been a spotlight. Instead, it became a candle in a room full of floodlights. I couldn't shake how strange that felt, how fragile the case suddenly looked under modern scrutiny. The more I read, the more the evidence began to feel like a ghost, a presence that had been in the room all along, unheard, ignored, misunderstood. Take the cell tower evidence. Back in 1999, those records were treated like stone tablets, end-all, be-all proof of movement, presence, guilt. But decades later, when experts explained how incoming call pings couldn't determine location, it felt like the foundation of a house cracking quietly in the night. No loud crash, just a slow, deliberate shift. And in that shift, the entire timeline began to wobble. I started imagining what it would feel like to build a prosecution's case on pillars that were now crumbling. How many people truly believed those calls placed Adnan at the burial site? How many jurors relied on that detail to fill in the gaps of a story that was never solid to begin with? The evidence didn't just whisper. It contradicted. It questioned. It demanded. I could almost hear the echoes of the original trial, expert witnesses giving confident statements, jurors leaning forward, prosecutors drawing lines on a map. And now, decades later, the same evidence was being reevaluated like a photograph that suddenly revealed a figure in the background you never noticed before. One document described phone records with disclaimers that were never presented to the jury, disclaimers explicitly stating that certain logs weren't reliable for location tracking. Reading that felt like watching someone pull wallpaper back to reveal rotting wood behind it. It was all there, hidden, overlooked, dormant, and the moment it was exposed, something inside me tightened, not because it was surprising, but because it wasn't. Then there was the stranger detail, evidence tied to a potential alternative suspect, a suspect whose notes, statements, or behaviors had been documented but never disclosed. The idea that someone else's threatening comments, violent history, or suspicious proximity had been pushed aside felt almost unreal. Like the plot twist in a crime show you don't want to believe because it makes everything else fall apart. Yet here it was, on paper, cold, factual, undeniable. The evidence that wouldn't stay dead. I kept thinking about how investigators back then must have felt, rushing against time, trying to build a narrative, pressured by media, by the community, by the urgency of a murdered teenager's case. Human beings don't always see clearly when they're under that kind of pressure. They grab the pieces that make sense at the time, and sometimes they overlook the pieces that don't fit the story they're constructing. But the thing about evidence is, it doesn't care about human narratives. It waits, sometimes quietly, sometimes angrily, sometimes long enough that the truth becomes distorted. In 2024, when new forensic evaluations showed the absence of Adnan's DNA on key items, it wasn't just a revelation, it was a reckoning, a whisper turning into a voice, a reminder that science grows even when cases stagnate. And that's what scares me most about this entire situation. It's not the crime, it's not the contradictions, it's not even the legal battle. It's the realization that the evidence has been trying to tell us something for years, and we just weren't listening. Maybe the evidence screamed at first, and no one heard it. Maybe it whispered and was ignored. Maybe it sat silently, waiting for technology to catch up so it could finally speak. Whatever the reason, the truth within that evidence feels like it's been pacing in its cage. And as I read through the newest reports, the newest disclosures, the newest expert statements, I felt something cold sink into my stomach. Because evidence doesn't change on its own. People change. Technology changes. Interpretation changes. But the physical truth, the biological truth, always had a story to tell. It's just that now, finally, we're hearing it. And what it's saying is far more unsettling than any theory. Because the evidence isn't pointing clearly toward a single narrative. It isn't telling the clean story people want. It's doing something far scarier. It's unraveling the old story, thread by thread, detail by detail, piece by piece, until what's left looks less like a solved crime and more like an open wound, a wound that's been bleeding quietly for 25 years, a wound that refuses to close, a wound stitched together with facts that don't align and truths that never had the chance to be heard. There's something eerie about stories that refuse to end. Most true crime cases have a shape, a finality, some kind of resolution we can point to and say, that's where it stopped. But the Adnan Syed case, it behaves like something alive. Every time it seems to settle, it stirs again, like a creature shifting in its sleep. And the more I watch the events of 2024 and 2025 unfold, the more I felt like this story had stopped being just a legal battle and had become something closer to a haunting. I remember reading the newest motion, filed at a moment when everyone thought the case had reached its last chapter. My chest tightened, not out of surprise, but because I recognized the pattern. Every time this story calls you back, it's because the past wasn't done speaking, not even close. And as my eyes ran down the page, I felt that familiar coldness settle behind my ribs. The same one that comes when you feel someone standing behind you, even though you know no one's there. The document wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't accuse anyone directly. But buried in the legal language was something chilling, a reminder that even after 25 years, truth is still slipping through the cracks. I kept thinking about how strange it is that an entire generation grew up with this case in the background. People got married, had children, changed careers, moved states, and this story stayed, like an echo trapped in the walls of time. If you were alive long enough, you witnessed the case in different eras: 1999, 2014 with Serial, 2019 with HBO's documentary, 2022 with the conviction vacated, 2023 with the reinstatement on procedural grounds, 2024 and 2025 with resentencing battles and new legal twists. It's rare for a case to mutate like this. It's rarer still for it to keep its grip on the public imagination. And I think I finally understand why. It's because every time the system tried to close the case, something inside it screamed. I sat with that realization for a long time, thinking about the people at the center of it all. Adnan, whose life is now a patchwork of courtrooms and motions. Hai Min Lee, whose memory is forever tied to a narrative she never consented to. Her family, living inside a grief that keeps getting reopened like an old wound. The lawyers, investigators, journalists, podcasters, strangers on the internet. Everyone holds a piece of the story, but no one holds all of it. And that, I think, is the real horror. The truth was never whole. It's fragmented, scattered, sharp, like pieces of broken glass that cut anyone who tries to pick them up. The newest filings brought that feeling back in full force. They talked about continued concerns with the original investigation, about the reliability of certain testimonies, about whether the vacating of the conviction had been handled properly, about victims' rights, about procedural fairness. It felt less like a legal argument and more like watching a house collapse in slow motion. Not the kind of collapse you hear from miles away. The quiet kind. The kind where the supporting beams rot from the inside, unnoticed, until the weight becomes too much and everything buckles, I found myself wondering what the attorneys on each side were thinking. Were they exhausted, angry, determined, haunted? Did they ever wake up in the middle of the night, remembering a detail they'd overlooked? Did they ever feel the weight of the fact that no matter what they argued, someone's life hung in the balance? The defense spoke about injustice. The state spoke about process. The appellate judges spoke about rules. And the public spoke about everything else. But beneath all the noise, there was a quieter truth. Someone wasn't telling the full story, maybe intentionally, maybe unintentionally, maybe because enough time had passed that even the people involved didn't remember the truth clearly anymore. One thing that stood out to me was the sense of fatigue in the language of the filings. You could feel it. A kind of frustrated acknowledgement that the case had become bigger than the crime itself, bigger than the people, bigger than the law. It had become something else, something sprawling and tangled that didn't fit neatly into the confines of a courtroom. And the more I read, the more I felt like this was less a murder case and more a psychological labyrinth, a place where people went to find answers and instead found versions of themselves they didn't expect. I remember pausing at one point, my eyes stuck on a single line in a judge's opinion. This matter requires clarity that the record does not currently provide. Clarity. What a fragile word in a case like this. I thought about the investigators from 1999 walking into Leakin Park with no idea that their steps would echo for decades. I thought about how evidence grows cold, how memories fade, how time reshapes truth until you can barely recognize it. And I thought about how every new motion seems to bring the case back to life, even when everyone is desperate to move on. It's a terrible thing, to be trapped in a story you didn't choose. The most haunting part of the latest filings wasn't what they said, but what they implied. That the story is incomplete, that someone, somewhere, knows something that the rest of us don't, that the case may never find an ending that feels like justice, because justice isn't a verdict, it's closure, and closure is the one thing this case refuses to give. As I reached the end of the document, I felt a weight settle over me. Not fear exactly, but something close. Something like the feeling you get walking down a hallway toward a room you've avoided for years. You don't know what you'll find. You just know you can't walk past it anymore. The truth is, the Adnan Syed case stopped being a legal story a long time ago. It became a mirror, a reflection of everything flawed, fragile, and frightening about the justice system. A reminder that time does not heal all wounds. Some wounds reopen. Some wounds fester. Some wounds whisper from under the surface until everyone involved is forced to listen. And now, in 2024 and 2025, the case stands at a strange crossroads, not resolved, not undone, not forgotten, just suspended, like a door half open, with darkness behind it that no one wants to step into. I stared at the final page for a long time. My mind kept circling back to the same question, over and over, in a way that felt almost compulsive. What if the story isn't unfinished? What if the truth is just something we were never meant to see clearly? Some cases end with answers. This one ends with something else. A presence, a chill, an echo. The feeling that the story isn't over because the truth hasn't been found. Or worse, because the truth was found once, and then buried deeper than the body itself. If you're still here with me, then you already know how deep these stories go, how far the truth can hide, and how easily a life can disappear into the shadows. And if you want to keep walking into places most people look away from, if you want more cases that unravel slowly, more mysteries that don't let you sleep, and more stories that linger long after the screen goes dark, then make sure you subscribe to Last Seen. Hit the bell so you don't miss the next descent into a case where answers twist, evidence whispers, and the past refuses to stay buried. This channel isn't just storytelling. It's the place where the forgotten return, where the truth comes back with teeth, and where every case is one step deeper into the dark. So, like the video, subscribe, turn on notifications, and I'll meet you in the next one, where someone else was last seen.